Manufacturing in the UK has to make some choices. For too many decades, we've told ourselves a story that perhaps reflects who we were, not who we are today. We're undoubtedly brilliant, but so are manufacturers in other countries, and arguably they have the benefit of more supportive governments. So we have to define what we want to be and how we're going to achieve it. I'm delighted to be joined by Jonny Williamson to discuss these issues. Jonny, I say it feels itself to be in crisis. Let's not get away from the fact that UK manufacturing is, even if a lot of people don't recognise it, an absolutely key player in the UK economy.
Absolutely, Nick. This is a sector that's responsible for £183 billion worth of output every year, roughly 10% of UK GVA. It supports 2.5 million jobs directly. It's 2/3 of total business spend on R&D, and we're the 9th largest manufacturer in the world. But we have been for some years now, and it wasn't so long ago that we were 7th. And those world rankings are based on the most current available data, which is 2019. So what impact have recent events had on those rankings? I suspect, unfortunately, they won't be favourable to the UK.
David Bailey, I'd like to bring you in here. Very great pleasure to have you with us here today. David Bailey from the Birmingham Business School. David, what do you say to this notion that UK manufacturing is champing a bit to get going, but is being held back?
I think what we're seeing at the moment is a mix of all the supply side disruption from COVID, which is still ongoing, the war in Ukraine, also Brexit, which has kind of had a big impact on supply chains and small firms in particular. At the same time, the UK economy is starting to contract, and we're going into what the Bank of England says will be one of the longest recessions on record. So both the supply side and demand side hit, which is impacting on manufacturing. Now, given what we just heard from Jonny, this fundamentally important sector of the economy, I think needs support to keep it going through what's going to be a recession and get it into the best possible position to be able to rebound. That's something that Germany does all the time. You know, they have things like part-time working, lots of support for manufacturers during shocks. We do very little. What is left of our manufacturing base is genuinely brilliant because it's been left on its own to struggle. We could do much more to support it.
So I guess the point is really what's missing in this mix? Where do we get the extra juice from in order to take UK manufacturing to where we all believe it can and should be? I asked this question of Juergen Maier and see what he sees as the core driver of the UK economy and prosperity going forward.
Well, I think I can answer that in 2 words, which is industrial strategy. We need one desperately. Now, look, before we sort of maybe talk down a little bit of what hasn't been happening well enough, I think it's also worth saying that the manufacturing sector, given the lack of industrial strategy and given all that's been thrown at us as a sector in terms of non-availability of labour, of inflation, of rising energy costs, I mean, we have been unbelievably resilient, haven't we? And I think we ought to start with a bit of a pat on the back and say, you know, what great work people have been doing. Having said that, Nick, you are so right. It's time that we really get serious about the sector as a nation and understand the value that exports, that manufacturing, that innovation really provides to the UK. And I'm afraid our government currently has fallen massively short.
Well, Juergen Maier is perhaps one of the great critics today of Brexit, and we have to mention Brexit in the context of this programme. And yet at the same time, I don't think we should fall down the rabbit hole of Brexit good, Brexit bad. Brexit just is. It's happened. There's no long-term view at the moment from the Labour Party, certainly, and definitely from the Tory Party, of re-entering the single market or the customs union. So it is just a fact of life with which we have to live. But as Juergen said, later in the interview I did with him, it's like a slow puncture. It's like sucking the air out of the economy. That's pretty much how you see it.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I think one of the frustrations with Brexit, whether you voted for it or not, is how much it sucks the air out of every conversation. It dominates everything, particularly government attention and business attention. Take one example, UK chemicals. This is a tremendously important sector, a leading sector for the UK. 15% of exported goods, 16% of UK manufacturing GVA. Companies have paid £500 million to comply with EU REACH and to gain access to 27 markets. They're now being told they have to pay up to 3 times that to comply with a UK equivalent. This is at a time when every company is feeling the pinch. I just wonder how much better spent could that time and money be?
David Bailey, as I say, we don't want to go into the whys and wherefores, pluses and minuses of Brexit, but it's fair to say that it is quite a backdrop against which industry has to drive itself into the future. And of course, as you mentioned, the pandemic and Ukraine. To what extent do you think the fact that the government has backed off any form of industrial strategy while placing Brexit in industry's path is sucking even more air out of our potential?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think we need a grown-up conversation about Brexit. I mean, only this week, Jeremy Hunt refused to accept OBR forecasts about impact of Brexit on the economy. And yet the government is talking about the need for growth. We know that Brexit is going to impact, is impacting on growth. The OBR forecast is a hit of about 4% of GDP long term. Its estimate, by the way, of the impact of COVID is about 2%. Brexit is going to have a bigger impact. We have a vaccine for COVID. We don't yet have a vaccine for Brexit. And what we need is a proper conversation about its impacts, particularly on the manufacturing sector and on what we're finding, particularly on smaller firms who struggle with not only what we were hearing about from Jonny then in terms of the changing nature of regulations and the constant extra costs that brings, but simple things like being able to deal with the extra customs paperwork and the rules of origin rules. And what we're finding is in many cases, some small firms are simply deciding, actually, do you know what? We can't be fussed with that. It's just too much hassle. So we need to better support our small firms and our manufacturers if we are to get through Brexit in the best possible shape. And that isn't a Ramona argument. Brexit is here, but we need to think about its impacts really maturely and honestly and think about how we can make the best of it.
So let's pick up on what Juergen Maier was saying there about industrial strategy, because we had one from 2017 to 2019, then it was abandoned. The Industrial Strategy Council went the way of all flesh. And when I interviewed the then industry minister, Jackie Doyle-Price, the other day, goodness me, I mean, she was in post for what? I don't know, a handful of weeks. We'll get onto that later in the programme. She said that she didn't like the words industrial strategy. She said they sounded Stalinist. Now, I put this to Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, and this was his reaction.
Look, if a government minister is saying that, I'm depressed by that because they clearly haven't been following the debate. I mean, the first thing I would say before I justify it in any other way is if a company comes to me, as they have done, in a sector which was, in this case, pharmaceuticals, which is the strength in the UK, and they tell me they're making a €1 billion investment, but it's in France, not the UK, and I say, well, what was the driving factors behind there? And they say, well, it was the Choose France strategy, the French approach, this what I would describe as the French industrial strategy. If as a British politician, you don't care about that, someone telling you that the offer, let's be frank, a higher rate of corporation tax in the UK, if that was more attractive for that investment to take place, well, ask yourself why. Ask that business why. Listen to what they are saying. And it is exactly that. It's the long-term institutional and policy framework being more attractive in other countries than it is here. The second thing I would say to them is, look, again, follow the debate. Like, I think the 1970s was a poor decade for economic policy making across the board, frankly, in this country. But no one is suggesting that comes back. This is not about picking winners. I think people know that's not even necessarily about picking sectors, I would say. It's about that missions-based approach. How do you put long-term consistency and policy making in place, which we haven't had, and we've got to be willing to have the humility to listen to businesses telling us they can't invest because they haven't had that. And we've had, unfortunately, a very extreme case of political instability in the last 6 weeks in the UK. But listen to that case and look at why when we have that very poor performance on business investment in the UK. Look at how other countries that have different, regulatory environments to us, different fiscal and tax incentives to us, if they're outperforming us, let's look at why that is. And I often think with Conservative colleagues, they might not like the term industrial strategy. I don't really care. But the fact is that however you describe it, this is simply about what is the mixture of policies and incentives and long-term commitments in a country that you're pitching to businesses in terms of what you care about. And particularly after the pandemic, and particularly after, I suppose, the global financial crisis, the idea that countries shouldn't care about where growth comes from or about how different sectors contribute to the economy. I mean, you couldn't get a better example, could you, than COVID and life sciences and the vaccine and the relationship that was required between government and business to deliver and get that vaccine out and produce it in the quantities required. If people aren't learning from that or listening to the debate, I am quite sad about that. But I no longer feel I have to justify using the terms industrial strategy or having one, because I certainly know business is talking in that language and knows what I mean. So, I feel very comfortable prosecuting that argument. I'm happy to work with any colleagues across the political divide if they still need some incentives and encouragement around that.
We'll be returning to the Labour Party's industrial strategy and their policy of having an industrial strategy council a little later in the programme. I should point out we did invite the government to bring a representative onto the programme, and we know that they like their representatives to talk to us because, as mentioned, we did talk to Jackie Doyle-Price, a recent industry minister, just a few weeks ago. The fact of the matter is they haven't got anybody who can come on this programme to talk to us, and so we'll just have to leave it at that. Jonny, I think we want to stay away from party politics in that sense, but I sometimes wonder whether business shouldn't be a bit more political. I certainly thought during the Brexit debate, post the referendum, that business could certainly have been a bit more aggressive when it came to defining what Brexit should be, and in fact speaking out against it.
I think there's a balance, isn't there, between laying out what could happen, the consequences, the potential worst case scenario, making people cognizant of what could happen, but also not necessarily losing the ear of the people that needs to hear those arguments and almost frightening them off. We heard during the pandemic that we didn't have time for experts, and maybe there was a little bit of that at the time as well.
That may be so, but I do believe that people are beginning to understand that they have to have a louder voice. Juergen Maier said at the beginning of the programme that it's time for us to stand up and make more of a noise about it. People are still cautious. I think when you listen to the next clip from Brian Holiday, you'll understand he doesn't like to be in the party political game. But by the same token, it's fair to say that Labour's industrial strategy is beginning to cut through.
I think it's safe to say industry has been calling for a long-term approach from government on industrial strategy. I think that's a fairly safe across the board ask of government. What I particularly like, if I look at the political ideas that I think are in play at the moment, is this idea of a strategy or an office for manufacturing that essentially exists by statute, a little bit like the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Committee for Climate Change. I like this idea that we would have an office really considering the manufacturing and industry, or industrial infrastructure matters beyond particular political cycles. So I think it has been disruptive. I've seen this through the change of various business ministers, of course, whilst we've been working with the Made Smarter Commission. So that is disruptive. So yes, I'd like to see a greater level of consistency when it comes to those sort of investment, the innovation and the skills policy instruments that we are so dependent on in industry to help make sure we have forward certainty. And it's always that it's the certainty that we need to encourage investment into the country, to encourage investment in skills, and indeed to stimulate investment in productivity and sustainability, enhancing technologies in our manufacturing environment. So these things matter. I would boil it down to a little bit more certainty would be good, and I think there are certain ways that we could achieve that would be helpful.
David, Labour's idea of reviving the Industrial Strategy Council is obviously going down well with Brian Holiday and others in business. but I would say it has to have power and has to have teeth. What do you think?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Now, the idea of some sort of permanent body, almost kind of with a legislative sort of basis in order to keep manufacturing and industrial strategy on the agenda, I think is really important. Just going back about 7 years ago, we published a book with a foreword by Mike Wright, former executive director at Jaguar Land Rover, arguing for exactly that thing. And I think what's important is that other countries just carry on doing industrial policy. We do it for a while and then stop. I've lost track of how many industrial policies we've had, basically. So, coming back to your question, if we're looking at a new way forwards, I think we need commitment from the government. We need serious resources, and that's lacking. You look at it, for example, in the context of government support for gigafactories in the UK. But we also need, and I think this is echoed in what we heard there from business people, is a collaborative approach, a participatory approach, where you bring government and business together to identify challenges and opportunities and then develop policies on the back of that. We had that for a while under Mandelson, Vince Cable, an effort as well under the Conservatives when they looked at an industrial strategy. That seems to have gone, sadly, and we need something in its place. We also had sort of efforts like the Automotive Council, the Aerospace Alliance, bringing together different actors. That worked pretty well. There were some issues, I think, about whether it really reached down the supply chain. But when we bring government and industry together in a collaborative way, it can work.
Picking up on what David's just said about it needs to reach down to the supply chain, the last Industrial Strategy Council most definitely did not do that.
Yeah, I think there was some frustrations that the council members didn't necessarily strongly reflect manufacturers. There was heads of large retailers, some tech developers, hedge fund managers, I think legal representation. There was a limited amount of manufacturers. So I think absolutely who makes up this new committee, this new council, it has to have manufacturing representation from the sectors that we know we're already very strong in and want to grow, things like automotive, aerospace, chemicals, but also needs representation for these future high growth areas of the economy as well. Things like electrification, low carbon, transport, renewable energy, things like that.
I don't think you find any argument at all from SMEs in UK manufacturing because, as we all know, they are desperate to be heard.
Firstly, government need to listening to SMEs. They need to give SMEs a voice because even if you look at the disaster of the apprenticeship levy, it was driven by big businesses. It didn't even apply to small businesses, and yet it's dramatically reduced the number of apprentices coming through. So speak to the smaller businesses, speak to the 1, 10, 50, 100 employee companies, and actually find out what it is they need, because they don't want handouts, they don't want extra money. What they want is to be able to use the people and the equipment they've got, train unskilled but really keen people, and be able to actually offset that against their profits.
Andrea Wilson making an interesting point there that if you take somebody who's unskilled and then train them into a skilled job, you can't set it off against tax because it's a capital investment. It seems to illustrate that the tax system is at least a little bit difficult to navigate. David, do you believe that the tax system is a useful way to incentivize manufacturers?
I think it does work. I mean, ultimately, when we're looking at things like training, there's a positive spillover from training. So firms underinvest because I think if we train somebody else may poach them. There's an underinvestment in innovation because, again, other firms may capture the benefit of that. So we can use the tax system through things like tax credits or support for training in order to help companies along. And you look, for example, at there's a really big effort underway under President Biden in the US to push an industrial policy and use tax breaks to really move things along. And that's having an impact. Look here in the UK, one of our big hopes, the kind of Tesla, as it were, of the UK auto industry, the van company Arrival, developing some fantastic electric van technology, originally said it was going to produce in the UK, has now said it will actually produce in the US. And that's been a big win for Biden's industrial policy and his tax approach.
I think it should also be mentioned that the tax regime in and of itself is a burden to small manufacturers. I spoke with Emily Smith, who, as well as running 2 manufacturing companies, she's a chartered accountant. She's also chair of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales Manufacturing Advisory Group.
I think it's a very overly complex system. I know there's been a lot of talk over the past few years in terms of trying to simplify it. I do think a simplified system would benefit not just manufacturing sector, but all sectors, take that onus off business owners. It's okay for the bigger companies because they have departments that deal with that, but for particularly SME market, it is difficult and we have to rely on paying large bills to advisors. And at the moment, we want to try and cut those costs.
David, I suspect if Labour were to come into power and implement the policy that introduces the Industrial Strategy Council, that is indeed something it should be looking at. The fact we seem to have a sort of one-size-fits-all policy, and that tends to suit big business because it's big businesses lobbying that tends to have created the policy in the first place.
Yes, I think that's right. And that's why it's really important that any sort of council or industry government bodies that we set up involve representatives from small businesses. I mean, I think there's a number of other elements to that. One is it would be much better if, for example, on some of the things we've been talking about training, we devolve it down to a regional level so that regional leaders and businesses can come together to decide what to do, rather than it being dictated by a kind of top-down quango in London whose initials I can't even remember because they keep changing so often. And so I think that would help also in enabling small firms to get better representation. There is, of course, a Brexit issue here as well, in that the government sold Brexit in terms of freeing us from EU regulation. Yet our record so far in terms of setting up alternative regulatory regimes has not been very good. We heard earlier about UK REACH. We can also think about UKCA, the marking that should replace CE. These things keep getting put back, creating more uncertainty. So even if there were benefits from Brexit, we've not seized them. For example, EU REACH, which companies have invested in very heavily, including small firms in the chemical sector, wasn't perfect. It was really cumbersome. It took a long time. There's an opportunity to improve on that, yet we've not had the bandwidth in the UK to actually come up with our own system, which is better.
I think there's another anomaly, isn't there, which is that policy seems to have been created for different times. For instance, job creation has historically been at the heart of policy because back in the day, unemployment was a really major issue. Nowadays, unemployment is not such a huge issue. Sadly, as we're going into recession, I think it might become more so again. But at a time when people are trying to get investment from the government to help them invest in technologies that will enable them to save jobs, because technically we're at a point of full employment, they find that the system is working against them. Let's listen to what Barry Leahey has to say from Playdale Playgrounds.
They link both of them, don't they? And, if I fill in another form that which all SMEs do, and SMEs find form filling quite laborious and not needed, but it will always ask you very, very quickly on that form, how many jobs will this create? We're going to give you this investment, how many jobs it's going to create. Well, at this moment in time, I think, left hand's not talking to the right hand. We've got virtually zero unemployment in the people that can be employed, yet we're going to incentivize companies to employ more people. Is that not just creating the problem? We're saying we haven't got the skills, but you know what? We're going to incentivize companies to employ people without the skills. It's how many jobs will this secure, or even better, how much profit will this generate? That's all we're interested in. To be the government, we need to pay back debt. Therefore, we need to make profit. Therefore, we need to make greater taxes. If my business makes more profit, I will pay more tax. I will happily pay more tax. If we can double our productivity, double our output with the same overheads, we will get twice the profit. Yeah. Or even more so. It's not even linear. It'll be vastly more. Everyone's a winner. Don't ask me how many jobs I'm going to create during the process.
David, do you think that we're suffering from policy pulling in different directions, and that maybe we don't need to spend vast amounts more money on manufacturing if perhaps we got our policies better aligned and resources better allocated?
Well, I think we need to do both. I think we need more resources to support our key industries and technologies going forwards, but we need to think more cleverly about how we align them and target them. So, we are going into a recession, but in the context of a very tight labour market. We also know that going forwards with Industry 4.0, a lot of jobs will be created, a lot destroyed, and there's going to be a need to constantly train and retrain people throughout their careers. So instead of policy focusing on number of jobs created, we could be looking at safeguarding, we could be looking at the quality of jobs, and we could be looking at how those jobs are able to work with new technologies going forward. So, the world is going to change in the fourth industrial revolution, and we need to change our policy settings in order to face that challenge, but also really realise some of the opportunities going forward.
And Jonny, we should really, at this point, emphasise, as if we need to emphasise, we've known it a long time, but we are desperately far behind our industrial competitors when it comes to investing in robotics and automation.
If the UK's serious about doubling manufacturing's contribution to the economy and hitting its target of £1 trillion worth of exports annually by 2030, with the country at full employment, then I think automation and robotics has to be a larger part of the conversation.
Let's go back to Barry Leahey, because he wonders what it's going to take for us to actually achieve that. Perhaps we need to get hungrier.
How hungry are we? I spend a lot of time in developing places like India. They are hungry to get every little bit out of every process, zero waste, moving at that pace, wanting to get to where they are, quicker, and they're missing out, 1970s and 1980s, and some of their areas are going straight to 2030. And we've got that infrastructure already, so it's a bit tougher for us to change, or it's a bigger headache to change. And maybe in the UK we go, well, you know what, it's good enough, and it's going to be a real headache to change. So we don't really need to make that investment just yet. And I guess that's where we're seeing people leapfrog us. It's sales at the end of the day. What you put in is what you get out. Why have we done really well? Well, I'm a true believer of leaving ego at the door and getting rid of some of that ego and UK arrogance that I think we have in the system. Unfortunately, I think it's indoctrinated into us that, we're British manufacturing. It means quality. It means we can sell our products anywhere. And then we knock on the door and they say, oh, you're not quite as competitive or as well priced as the other. So, and we give up far too easily. We've just been really persistent. We've got resilience baked in, and we just keep getting up when we get knocked down. And that's just led us to prove ourselves to customers, and not rely on, history. We're saying, like, this is who we are and this is what we're about, and we want to really wow you, and then we make sure that we wow them.
So David, that point about the fact we're going to have to compete on innovation and quality, we can't compete on price apparently, that puts even more pressure on R&D and on the manufacturing sector to stay ahead.
Yes, it does. Remember, that's in the context of all the shocks that have been impacting on manufacturing: COVID, energy costs, Brexit. So, manufacturers having to work harder just to stay competitive, but then having to invest on top of that. I think that's hugely important, because if we look forwards, then internationally, we're going to compete in markets not at the bottom end. It's going to be high value added, cutting edge technologies. One of my big concerns, actually, if you look at the auto industry in recent months, is that we know that we should be transitioning, for example, to electric cars, yet we've seen mini shift production of electric cars to China, arrival to the US, British Volt stall, and London Electric Vehicle Company lay off workers. So yet we know that's the direction of travel. So, I think we need to be thinking a lot more strategically, thinking about where we want to go, and supporting companies to invest in these new technologies of the future.
And that was precisely the point that David Bond, who's CEO of Sheffield Forgemasters, put to me.
Take a leaf out of a book of the European nations. They, industrially, their governments tend to have a clearer view of what they're trying to achieve in their industrial strategy. They'll have a clear view that says, we want to have core technology around nuclear energy or offshore wind, and we'll work with local companies to invest and bring their skills up to speed and make sure they're competitive. And what that creates is not only if you like, a local capability, but it's a capability you can export to other nations, which in a way, we're the reverse of that in the UK. You know, we're a good example of when other people invest in that, we can bring that skill into the UK. We can bring that component to the UK. I'd like to see that reversed. I want to see, you know, the UK government having a clear view on what it really wants to onshore to underpin. It doesn't have to be everything. It can never be everything. But what it really wants to underpin onshore, so that the intellectual property is onshore, your ability to export and move those high-value products out of UK companies into if you like, offshore customers is reversed, and we end up seeing ourselves in the same situation. And I could pick out an example actually, which I'm hoping it ultimately comes off. You know, working with our friends in Rolls-Royce, a big customer of ours, Rolls, both in defence for submarines and also now in civil nuclear. You know, they're working with UK government on developing and going through the licensing process for a small modular reactor. You know, it's given the skills that we've got around defence, it's a perfect adjacency for us. But actually, they're one of the few examples of a British company with British intellectual property looking to onshore a lot of its capability. And if that works, then the global demand for that kind of product is huge. And suddenly you create an environment where actually UK is at the centre of an export program. I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see the government try and create the conditions and encourage the conditions where more of those decisions are made for the long term and British manufacturing can take advantage of it.
David Bond's point that there is a bright new future available to us in areas like small modular reactors, clean energy, begs the question, David Bailey, that net zero is something we really need to grasp if we're going to launch UK manufacturing into a bright new future.
Yes, it is. I mean, we face this kind of twin transition of embracing Industry 4.0 and also moving towards net zero. The two can actually, if we play this really cleverly, be brought together to tackle some of these really big challenges, societal challenges that we face. But, you know, we know in the future we are going to use lots of batteries. We know that there's going to be a need to make heat pumps. We know there's going to be a need for wind turbines. You know, there's an opportunity to diversify our existing manufacturing base into products that we know will be needed in the future. And the government, I think, needs to be involved in the conversation with manufacturing through a participatory approach to make sure it happens here in the UK, rather than, for example, by 2030, when we ban internal combustion engines, we're driving around in electric cars made in China. So, you know, there's a big role for government to get involved in the conversation, help join up the dots and play a part in a collaborative approach.
The point that David Bond was making, that we need these hubs, the great danger of something like the weakness in British Volt, the fact, as you said, that many's been moved to China and arrival to the US, means we're losing those opportunities, and it's going to be tough to get them back once they've gone.
Yes, it is. I mean, at the moment, if we look at the UK car industry, I would describe it as a slow motion car crash. You know, we're seeing some key investment decisions going the wrong way. The government needs to be much more closely involved. It's been kind of standing on the sidelines, the pavement, watching that unfold. And it needs to be working with automakers, potential investors in the battery industry to join them up and get the investment into the UK. It also means a lot more investment support because the amounts on offer in the UK are way below what is available in the European Union. But, you know, let's be clear, unless we make batteries at scale in the UK, we are not going to have a mass car industry. So if we're really committed to having a mass car industry, certain things follow from that, and there needs to be a follow through on industrial strategy.
So, Jonny, David Bond was talking about onshoring because he sees the opportunity in some of these new technologies for onshoring. But a new word is being bandied about, greenshoring. Tell us a bit about that.
So for decades, as we know, standard business practice has been to move your manufacture to cheaper, less developed countries, offshoring of production. Greenshoring takes that focus from low cost, but it places it on low carbon. So as more and more companies look for a green, low carbon supply chain, any manufacturing base that can provide evidence of that capability is going to have a really key competitive advantage moving forward.
Well, I know that the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland, which is part of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, they are making progress on this. Paul Cantwell tells us more.
Where we're wanting to see direction is to ensure that we're building the foundations required for green shoring activities. And what we mean by that is a low carbon manufacturing base, where we're not competing on economics, but we're competing on the environmental impact of the manufacturing that we're creating and that manufacturing community as well. You know, consume less, but use for longer life expectancies with a positive outcome. We're trying to enable companies to actually unpick their value chain and what that means in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon accounting or carbon equivalent, and where some of the interventions are required, both from reshoring supply chains to create a more local economy where it has significant impact to the embedded carbon footprint associated to logistics, movement of materials and natural origins of materials. But it's also around ensuring extension of life and utilising the assets already in service. So in the UK, we're enriched with national assets, great infrastructure, but that's also a materials bank as well that we can utilise for when an asset comes to the end of its initial life. How can we recover that in a meaningful way to make the next generation of high value products more sustainable? It's also about enabling companies as well to understand where the technology needs to be invested in. So how are they decarbonising their operations? How are they moving from conventional manufacturing processes to more advanced processes that hold a lower embedded greenhouse gas emission in operation and performance?
David, Paul Cantwell was offering a vision of the future there, where we have to basically change our mindset about how we make things, how long we use them for, and how we reuse and repair them. Is there a future that manufacturing can rely on in that, what he would describe again as green shoring initiative?
I think that was absolutely fascinating. And I think in a sense, it's make or break for manufacturing. We're going to see the European Union, for example, introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a carbon border tax. We're going to have to do something similar in the UK. There's a danger that if we don't link that with the EU, manufacturers in the UK will be paying for carbon and then also having to pay a tax to export to the EU. So we've got to join up with the EU on this. But ultimately, we have to count carbon. And if we don't pay for that carbon in reflect the real cost, we'll face tax on exports. So trying to do things using as little carbon as possible and making sure we capture the full costs of that is going to be absolutely critical for business going forwards. That's the kind of macro framework. Within that, I think at a regional level, there needs to be a much more devolution of industrial strategy down to the regional level to work with clusters to then think about how these technologies are used and used to kind of reinvent some of the key sectors that we've got around the country.
I think what David's said there around counting carbon is going to become absolutely critical, but doing so means addressing the lack of common standards for carbon accounting we've got at the moment. Without a proper auditing and monitoring system in place, there's no way of setting targets and measuring progress towards them. So I think pulling together a common standard for carbon accounting is absolutely critical. And I know that the HVM Catapult is really focusing on this area, and I think it needs much broader pickup by industry and government because it's absolutely critical.
I'd like to pick up on something David said there about the regions, because localities matter. Manufacturing companies attract other manufacturing companies. They provide jobs to local people. Now, that clustering or flocking effect is very important. I know that we've been a little bit downbeat because of the departure of a couple of companies that David mentioned a short while ago. But the fact is we do have success stories in the country at the moment, creating just this magnet effect we're looking for.
A really good example of that is the Zero Carbon Humber initiative, which is drawing on the region's existing skills and infrastructure in the petrochemical industry and developing them for the low carbon hydrogen economy. It's a huge project all built around this shared pipeline network. It's not only going to protect 55,000 existing jobs, but it's going to create a similar number in new ones, as well as apprenticeships and educational opportunities to bring along the next generation. Now, the size of this project is such that there's a huge opportunity to drive as much content and value into the UK supply chain as possible. Now, companies looking to enter that supply chain, if they already support the petrochemical industry, is a fairly straightforward pivot. But for some businesses without the experience, there needs to be some sort of mechanism to get them hydrogen ready, fit for hydrogen, if you were. And that's where you take something like the Nuclear AMRC's Fit for Nuclear programme, and that's a great demonstration of what can happen with the right policy and support structure in place to help companies enter these booming, really lucrative industries. And what's critical is that these industries are obviously growing here, there's opportunity here, but they're happening all over the world. So there's an opportunity to enter global supply chains.
If anybody is in any doubt about the importance of large magnet companies and what they do for local and national supply chains, you only have to look at BAE Systems. Let's hear from Ian Linton.
From a recent study from Oxford Economics, pretty much for every pound spent, nearly £2 is spent in terms of contributing to the UK economy. And that feeds through supporting local jobs in the UK through the jobs that we perform. So, for example, for every job that we have, the report showed that there are 3 extra jobs in the economy generated because of that industry, really supporting that UK SME support.
David, do you think there's any argument at all that we need to grow more middle-sized Tier 1 style companies in this country to act as those magnets?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So we've got fantastic assemblers like Rolls-Royce, Jaguar Land Rover, BAE and so on. Part of the problem we face is that the supply chain has been hollowed out, and we need to come back and kind of, as it were, rebuild the supply chains for very good reasons. I think there's a big opportunity around reshoring. Green shoring is part of that. The long supply chains that we've seen, that we've referred to earlier, have been subject to lots of risks. There's a chance to redo things more locally, and that involves building up some of these small, medium-sized companies. There are barriers to that, however: energy costs, availability of land, skills, which we've spoken about, the financing needs to actually gear things up. So one of the projects I'm involved in at the moment is looking at this reshoring opportunity, what the barriers are, and also how we can overcome those. But you're absolutely right. Building out the supply chain, supporting sort of medium-sized Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 firms, critical if we're not only going to create value in the UK, which we're very good at, but also capture it in the UK as well.
This was a point that David Bond from Sheffield Forge Masters put to me as well.
If as a country we decide that we are going to be a major fabricator or assembler of something, so if you take shipbuilding, for example, if you decide you're going to build ships in the UK, then what tends to happen is a supply chain builds up around it. It doesn't mean that the whole supply chain has to locate around the shipyard, but it's a funny old thing. What you tend to find is a lot of small and medium-sized companies do migrate to where that central hub is for that activity. You see the same in the car industry. You see the supply chain of the car industry. It's a funny old thing. When you assemble cars in the UK, then you end up with a supply chain that builds up around that assembly. So I'd like to, again, if I go back to industrial strategy, for example, I think if the UK thought that through a little bit more, and you suddenly found some of the really big Tier 1 type companies basing themselves in the UK rather than Europe, the Siemens, the GEs of this world, etc., then I think you would find supply chains and those smaller companies growing bigger because they're working around those central hubs of big engineering content in the UK. So some of that for me still flows down to have a clear industrial strategy about what it is you really want, what kind of skills and what kind of industry sectors you really want in the UK.
David, how important in the absence of a national industrial strategy do you think it is that the regions take more control of their own destiny, and how much power have they actually got to do that?
I think whether or not the centre's playing an active role, there's a really critical role for regional industrial strategies. So, but in a sense, that's even more important when central government is AWOL, which is what we've seen of late. The issue is we don't really have a very powerful regional tier. Now, if we go back to the last industrial strategy under Greg Clark, he did a great job, I thought, in trying to set out a vision. His big effort was to put place into the industrial strategy. Sadly, that didn't happen because the Treasury effectively overruled that, and we didn't have much of a place-based element to it. It's essential that we build that up further. What's happened since is you've got organisations like Innovate UK and the Catapults, who we've mentioned many times so far, have stepped into the breach. They're effectively doing a place-based industrial strategy by default because nobody else has the resources to do it. In many cases, they're working very closely with regional level bodies. The problem is the regional level bodies have limited resources and limited powers. Here in the West Midlands, for example, a great mayor in Andy Street, he's somebody who sees what needs to be done, but his brief is largely transport based. And when it comes to some of the big challenges that we face locally, like transforming the supply chain, trying to attract in a big battery manufacturer, he doesn't have much in the way of resources or powers. And that's the problem. We have a very, very centralised system in the UK.
I think it's fair to say that Juergen Maier, when we talked about localised industrial policy, was slightly more optimistic.
Greater Manchester, I'm involved in the local industrial strategy. And by the way, I think this is a very good way forward. If nationally we're lacking leadership, then let's just do it locally. And I'm seeing that happening up and down the country. The North East is doing it. The Humber is doing it. In Greater Manchester, we are developing our industrial strategy, which is all around advanced materials and around advanced manufacturing. And there is a huge opportunity for advanced materials in lightweighting. And then you can, create smaller, nimble companies, maybe including some additive manufacturing. And these can form supply chains into new aerospace, into the new electric vehicles markets. And of course, to get the scale, they've got to be able to export.
All of this leads to the $64 billion question. What do we actually want to do? What do we have? And more important, perhaps, what's no longer fit for purpose? David, pick up on that, if you will. What do you think we should be heading for in terms of an all-round UK industry 50 years hence?
We're going to face big challenges. We're going to have to change our society and economy to get to net zero. At the same time, we've got to embrace the new technologies of Industry 4.0. So those are the kind of the big challenges that industry faces. How they play out in each industry, in different regions, will be done differently. That's why there's a really important role, as we heard from Juergen there, for regional industrial strategies. But it's about taking these big kind of general purpose technologies almost, and then thinking about how we apply them at a sectoral and regional level. That could look different in automotive as against aerospace, as against pharmaceuticals. But it's about embracing those challenges, repositioning industry to address society's future needs, and at the same time, capture value in the UK.
I want to ask you a question about volume manufacturing. I'll tell you why that's so, because the other day I was going around social media, as one does, and I tripped over a vacuum cleaner company, British vacuum cleaner company, called Halo Appliances, the Halo capsule they call it. And I thought, a British vacuum cleaner, I hadn't heard of it. So I rang them up and said, do you make your vacuum cleaners here in the UK? And Paul Bagwell, who's the co-founder of the company, said, unfortunately, no, we can't do that at the moment. And he said, basically, it's because we don't have the capacity, as David said earlier, it's been hollowed out, to do any volume manufacturing on any scale in this country. Let's hear Paul's story.
I think the more of this that happens in the UK, the easier it gets. And it's not just, we're Halo Appliances is a vacuum cleaner brand at this stage. It's not just about vacuum cleaners. It's about high volume, not inexpensive but affordable, attainable product. The more of that goes on, there is a bigger community, there is a bigger economy of scale that allows us to do more of it. It's a flywheel effect of this becoming an area of competency for us. The UK manufacturing is excellent at high value, low volume, precision things, and we are not quite in that sphere. This is much more of a consumer product. This is much more high volume. And I think it needs to, we need to start that flywheel. As I say, in our plan, we want to onshore this, and there is going to be some hard battles to do that because we are going to be amongst the first to onshore this sort of product. But we believe those battles are worth fighting because it doesn't just bring that economy of scale for kind of us, it brings it for a whole community, for the whole of the UK manufacturing. For us, it's worthwhile because it's core to our brand. It's something we really believe in, and our customers value it very highly. So it's something that we want to do. It's just doing it at a point where we can support it. There is almost a penalty to us at this stage of manufacturing in the UK, and that is a price worth paying because of what it will do for our brand, what it will do for our customers. But it is, it's not a no-brainer. It is a decision we have to make, cognizant of all the facts and the impact it's going to have on our business.
So, David, do you think that Paul Bagwell ever has a chance of manufacturing his vacuum cleaners at scale in volume in the UK?
There is a chance, but we are seeing some reshoring of manufacturing coming back to the UK. That, going back to where we started, requires a supportive industrial strategy to get there. And if we think back to when we had a more collaborative approach between government and business, we used to have something called the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative. It was delivered by the Manufacturing Advisory Service. Most of those things have gone as part of the ditching of our industrial strategy. So if we really want to push forwards a kind of revival of manufacturing, bringing activity back locally, albeit in a very different form to how it existed previously, we need an active industrial strategy to push that forwards. That's ultimately a political will. Do we have the will to actually do that? At the moment, we don't. Personally, I think we should be doing much more to make it happen.
And that was the point, really, that Brian Holliday from Siemens put to me. He was talking about all the things we want in a future industrial base in the UK, but he's also very clear that it's going to take a lot of intent.
So I think it's very much about growth, it's about skills, it's about innovation. And if we stop investing in those things, we do seriously risk harming the manufacturing sector because, of course, it's a globally competitive race and we need to continue to stay ahead. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful that it's not characterized by Industry 4, you're in or you're out. Digitalization, particularly post-pandemic, as we've recognized the need to work remotely, to design and simulate and verify things in the digital world. We've seen this sort of pandemic accelerated adoption of digital technologies in certain sectors, and we're starting to see some of the really good news stories flow through from that. So I think there's a lot to be said for getting beyond storytelling about Industry 4 and recognizing actually how technology has an increasingly important role to play in addressing some of manufacturing's challenges, which now we know are numerous. And these are resilience, their cyber, their labour, their productivity, and they are sustainability oriented. And tech plus expertise has a role to play in helping address all of those.
Brian Holliday summing up what he sees as the way forward for industry. I've got a bit of a personal beef here about the way that business deals with government. As I said earlier, I sometimes think that they adopt a bit of a cringe, that they fear losing access if they speak truth unto power. I suspect it's the other way around. I suspect that if business shouted out a lot more about what it needed from government and said it to government very directly, then government would be forced to sit up and take notice. And Juergen Maier very much agrees.
I would just call it strong leadership. And look, when you've had business secretaries come and go at the rates we've had, quite frankly, when we've had prime ministers come and go at the rate we have, it's fair and right that business says, look, we are here for the long term. You are here for the short term and have been, even more short term than ever. And now is the time where, we demand that you listen to us with our long-term view and what we have to offer and the value we create for the United Kingdom. And look, let's take just one sector. Let's take the car sector. Hugely important to the United Kingdom, both in terms of assembly, but also the supply chain. Massive opportunity to move into electric vehicle. I'm also very passionate about hydrogen vehicles. Our industrial strategy has been absent. It's not been there. And when we hear of companies like Mini moving their electric vehicle manufacturing out of the UK, by the way, not even to Europe, but to China, when we hear of British Volt struggling to finance the great work that they're doing for battery manufacturing in the UK, the reason is that we're lacking an industrial strategy, which then means that investors lack the confidence to come behind and invest in these activities. And you know, government has just got to start listening to us on that, because the evidence is there.
Juergen Maier really suggesting, David, there that leadership has to be both political as well as coming from business itself. And I suspect also we need to make the point to the population that this is a manufacturing country, that we still make things. And we've got to get rid of this stupid notion that we don't make things in Britain anymore. I wonder if you've got any ideas about how we might try to do that.
That's a great question. I mean, I think certainly if we can get people as early as possible into manufacturing and see it, you know, it's not the oily, dirty, sort of smoky place that it was 100 years ago, but you go into a modern manufacturing facility, it's clean, it's high tech, you're working alongside lots of robots. It's not just making things, but all sorts of things around it in terms of design, research, the servitization, providing a service alongside manufacturing, and that it's hugely important to the economy. So I think, particularly if we can get school children into manufacturing early on to see it, if we can increasingly in universities get our students into placements with manufacturing, you know, got students that have been on placements in various manufacturing firms, they come back full of enthusiasm for manufacturing and would very much like to go back again and continue their careers. So I think early engagement, absolutely critical. Celebrating our success stories whilst also being honest about some of the challenges that we face.
Well, I think the good news is, it's, again, assuming Labour wins the next election, because otherwise they're not going to be able to implement their industrial strategy. But it does feel like they're smelling the coffee and are prepared to offer the kind of leadership that Juergen Maier was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I really want to say is that I will have absolutely no truck with anyone who says to me that concern and regard and passion for the manufacturing sector is somehow kind of nostalgic or obsolete or a thing for the past. The idea that everybody works in services these days. I'm proud of the services sector in this country, but if people are trying to say that UK manufacturing is not important to this country's economic future and not a fundamental part of our economy, well, I think they're wrong. I mean, I just think it's as straightforward as that. And I don't think I am being nostalgic by caring about sectors like automotive, which is such a vibrant and essential part of the British economy as it works, and which have had such a success. And we should, you know, I don't think any other country would be casual about that success and wouldn't want to make sure the right competitive framework was in place to ensure that future success.
Jonny, let's wrap this up now. Let's think of a couple of headline points that you'd like to make about what manufacturing needs to do to take us into that future.
I think, Nick, it's really three things, three interconnected points. The first is obviously that long-term industrial strategy, an industrial council or committee, whatever form it takes, but this long-term vision, clear engagement from the government that's long-term, robust and flexible and willing to adapt, because this really is a matter of national economic security. Second is better allocation of funding. Not new funding by any means, but a more efficient system pulling on the right policy levers based on the appropriate metrics. And thirdly, this is about embodying a growth mindset. Don't necessarily wait for an industrial strategy to materialise, like embrace the opportunities that are available today.
Jonny, thank you very much indeed for that. And David Bailey in Birmingham, thank you so much for your contribution to the programme. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Nice to talk to you both.
It's fair to say that all of the above amounts to different ways of pretty much saying the same thing, that manufacturing needs to start delivering a series of kicks to the backside, perhaps to itself, doubling down as Brian Holiday put it, but most importantly to government, to get it to offer the kind of national leadership manufacturing can get behind. From all of us here at Manufacturing TV, goodbye.